the next talk, we have Lilly Ryan with us. So Lilly is a lead security specialist at ThoughtWorks Australia, and she's going to talk about the ups and downs of rolling off your own. So Lily's a little bit of Lily's introduction before I hand it over to Lilly. Lilly, as I told, is a lead security specialist on the regional InfoSec team at ThoughtWorks Australia. She has many years of experience in doing information security, and Lily serves on the board of Digital Rights Watch, an Australian digital rights organization. She's also specialized in web application security, privacy education, and history of technology related issues. So you can catch her on the OAS DevSlop show, or occasionally she also shares her opinions on Bite into IT in Melbourne radio station. So that's a bit about Lily. Thank you so much for being here, Lily, and over to you for your talk.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you being here too. I'm just gonna find my correct microphone, and then hopefully that will work. And then I'll find my screen as well. Nikhil, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
Yep.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks. All right. Well, hope you've all had a good day so far, but good morning. Hi. Thank you for coming to the ups and downs of rolling your own. I hope you're all safely secured in your seats, because we are in for a wild ride in the next half an hour. This is a joke, because I'm going to talk about theme park rides today. So, my name's Lilly Ryan. This is how you can find me on Twitter, if Twitter is your thing. I am an ex-historian. I'm a penetration tester. I'm currently a lead security specialist at ThoughtWorks, which is what it says underneath my face. And over the last decade, I've had a lot of different roles in the tech industry, but most of them have revolved around security, because my main specialty is paranoia as a service. During my time working as a penetration tester, I've seen hundreds of different apps built on hundreds of different stacks, which is only a very mild exaggeration, honestly. And they've all had varying levels of success and also varying levels of security. One thing a lot of them have in common these days is that they're built on top of frameworks and services that help developers make the best and the smartest choices for app design management. And they're based on precedent that's been set by the last few decades of experience. I know I'm telling you things that I'm sure you all already know here, but the other thing that I've learned from being a penetration tester is that there are still plenty of places out there that are utterly convinced that their solution, their app, is so completely unique and particular that they are going to need to do all of the stuff themselves from the ground up. I've only really worked on one or two apps that were all entirely custom code, but even when you are using common libraries and frameworks, there can be a temptation to ditch those built-in modules for your own homebrew thing. And what I've learned from most of these attempts is this: custom code is the best place to find security vulnerabilities. When you're going for something that's bespoke in parts of the system that control basic security functions, especially authentication, which is the example I'm going to focus most on in this session, it almost always ends up with penetration testers like me treating your admin console like their own lounge rooms. Authentication is the thing we all use to make sure our users are who they say they are. And it's the first step to deciding if our users get to have access to the information and the features that they're requesting access to. There are a lot of ways to break software as an attacker, but authentication is one of the core things that you need to be sure that you're getting correct right from the beginning. Friends don't let friends roll their own cryptography, and friends shouldn't let friends roll their own auth either. All common app frameworks have well-tested authentication functions, and there are whole third-party services like Auth0 and Amazon Cognito that can also take the complexities out of authentication features and out of your hands and give it to experts. I know that you folks are already very interested in doing security well because you're here at this event today, but I'm not really here to convince you. I'm here to give you the tools that you might need to get other people on board with this idea. And I'm about to tell 3 stories that you can pull out the next time that you walk into a meeting with that senior project stakeholder who's totally sold on making the team develop a bespoke login function, because what you're doing is so groundbreaking that nobody else will cater for you perfectly. So why are we talking about theme parks? As I said before I was in tech, I spent a chunk of my life thinking I was going to be a historian. Moving from history into tech has given me a pretty interesting view of the ways in which we continually try to reinvent the wheel. And in the tech world, we like to do it even faster than they do out there in the rest of the universe. All software is ultimately about people, and people have dealt with the same categories of problems over and over throughout history. And we are here to talk about application security, but I thought I'd talk about theme parks with you for a bit, not least because I think theme parks are really fascinating, because they are very weird places if you think about it, but also because I think that theme parks present us with some great analogy opportunities, and I love nothing better than a good analogy. For the avoidance of any confusion, when I say theme parks, I mean that intersection of adrenaline and sugar that usually features roller coasters and water slides and funhouse mirrors and ugly, overpriced souvenirs. I've made an illustration so you can see what I mean. Can folks see that? Can you see my slides at the moment?
Yes, Lily.
Yeah, great, cool. All right, good. Well, this illustration will hopefully help you understand what I'm talking about. So theme parks, very complex environments. They have many moving parts that need to be designed and maintained by technical experts. Each ride in a theme park presents its own set of really specific challenges and specialties. And they are, at the end of the day, designed to be user-facing, which means that the people who run the parks are faced with a million novel and interesting ways that people will try to use their product and use their product wrong. Theme parks also have the potential to produce extremely bad outcomes if things don't go right. So if the rides stop working, you'll get very immediate user complaints. But if the rides break badly, you get user injuries and deaths. And in most cases where this happens, the rides are either poorly designed, poorly maintained, or poorly operated, and sometimes all 3 of those things. Security and safety are things that you really shouldn't be winging, no matter how cool the end idea might be. Just like with app security, if you ignore established conventions or you ignore expert advice and you go straight to rolling your own, the outcomes are likely going to be bad, and your users will suffer, and your reputation will suffer along with it. So, as I said, here are 3 stories and 3 lessons that you can take back to your workplace if you ever need them. This first story is about the Derby Racer. And this is the story that you can use when someone is like, I've just written the user story, and our password policy is going to be a maximum of 8 characters with at least 1 uppercase and 1 lowercase and 1 special character, as long as it's not an angled bracket. So the very first roller coasters in the way that we think of them today, they started being built in the mid-1880s in the United States. And they grew out of this extremely 19th century urge for white guys with big sideburns to build incredibly inadvisable things and just see if they get away with it. Successes from this period include the electric light and the telephone and the bicycle, and failures from this period include arsenical playing cards, a thing called the face glove, which is real, you can look that up, and the pseudoscience of thinking that you could tell somebody's personality by the shape of their skull. In my opinion, roller coasters land kind of somewhere in the middle of these. The early days of roller coasters were a bit of a free-for-all, kind of like the early days of anything, really. And in the middle of all of the experimentation, there were a series of truly horrible roller coasters built on Revere Beach in Boston in the United States. And they started with the Derby Racer. The Derby Racer was a wooden roller coaster in a kind of figure-8 shape with a twin track. And it's called a racer because there were carriages on each track that would kind of race side by side. The Derby Racer started construction in early 1911, and it opened not long afterwards. And on June 8th, 1911, a guy called Oscar Young had the misfortune of being the first person to be thrown from this roller coaster. To the extremely mild credit of the ride's operators, the Derby racer was shut down for 2 weeks after Young's accident for safety inspections. But shortly after it reopened, the treasurer of the company that made the roller coaster stood up in one of the coaster cars before it took off to give a speech about roller coaster safety, and he tripped and fell over the edge and died. So after this, the ride operators decided to take the very novel step of installing things like brakes, which the carriages didn't previously have, and also safety harnesses that the passengers could wear while they were in the cars, which seemed like a pretty good move. It didn't stop the accidents, though. So in 1917, another guy met his end on the Derby racer when his hat blew off his head as the coaster was in operation. He reached out to try and grab the hat, lost his balance, and fell onto one of the twin tracks, where he collided with the other series of carriages. And according to a newspaper article in the Boston Globe at the time, he, quote, broke every bone in his body. I'm not sure that's actually true. Newspapers, particularly back then, weren't super concerned with accurate facts, but it was bad. There were also more serious accidents after that one. A couple were injured in the same accident in 1923, and then there was one more person who was injured in 1929 by being thrown from one of the carriages as it rounded a sharp turn in the track. The guy from the 1929 accident survived, and he brought a lawsuit against the operator of the Derby racer. And as a result of this, in 1935, the Massachusetts Supreme Court shut the Derby racer roller coaster down, citing safety concerns, just for some reason. That 1935 ruling, that turned out to be a pretty important one in setting the standards for roller coaster safety for many years to come. So in that case, the court found that it wasn't enough for the roller coaster operators to ensure safety by hanging a sign out the front of the coaster that called it safe, sane, and sensible, which they did. Also, it seems like a weird way to advertise a roller coaster, if you ask me. Anyway, the court also said that it wasn't enough to print a message on the admission ticket that said, you know, the person using this ticket assumes all the risk of personal injury, loss, or damage to property. The court noted that the plaintiff had simply received the ticket and stuffed it into his pocket in an age-old example of the fact that people don't read things. They just don't. And also that writing things down doesn't always make them true. It turned out that the roller coaster operator had to actually do real and concrete things to look after their customers' safety properly, like installing better safety harnesses, putting up signs that informed people about what the safety harnesses were for, and making sure that they wore them, and also doing regular safety inspections, none of which the court believed the roller coaster operators had proved that they could actually do, and so the Derby racer was shut down. This leads me to lesson 1. Older isn't always better. Just because something has been in use for a really long time, it doesn't make it the best that there is. It just means that it came first. Early attempts and interpretations are often remembered really fondly, but everything is only one step along the way in improving the state of the art in that field. So when it comes to software security, especially authentication functions, we've also come on a really long journey since the early shared computer systems where passwords were all kept in plain text in one document. And as our needs have become more complex and threats have become more complex, we've needed to adapt and change. It's not enough just to hash passwords when you store them. It's not enough just to use any old hashing algorithm either. As time wears on, computing power gets faster, collisions get discovered, the older methods become obsolete. There are plenty of apps that have done away with the hashing and salting entirely in favor of passwordless auth methods, and there are many other approaches to those ideas that may or may not stand the test of time, but that we're trying out right now. Regulation and failure helps us a lot in this journey. So just like the rulings that came out of the Derby racer case, they made future roller coaster operators safer. We can make detailed notes on what didn't work and decide how we want to go forward based on that information. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't experiment at all, but when it comes to core safety and security functionality, it's always best to take a look around, and use the lessons that other people have learned to steer your decisions in a better direction. Our second story today is about the Cannonball Loop, which I learned about because of a Twitter thread, and I have been kind of obsessed with it ever since, honestly. So this story I'm about to tell, this is the story that you can use when someone's like, check it out, I've implemented the authorization entirely in client-side JavaScript, which is a real thing I have seen people do in actual projects. So the Cannonball Loop was an ill-fated waterslide that was designed and built at Action Park in Vernon, New Jersey in the US in the 1980s. And honestly, I could have given this talk entirely about Action Park, but I've mixed it up for the sake of variety. Action Park was sometimes known as Traction Park or Class Action Park for the number of injuries and accidents that occurred there, just as a matter of course. The park ended up buying their own ambulances for the town of Vernon, where they were based, simply to deal with the large number of ambulance callouts that the park would receive during the summer months. Like, this is their safety record. Action Park had a large number of absolutely bonkers rides that included things like the battle action tanks, which let park guests operate small tanks that fired tennis balls at each other. There were also super speedboats and bumper boats attractions where guests could race small boats around a snake-infested lake, and they would often deliberately crash them into each other. The boats often leaked fuel into the water, and this would sometimes burn the riders. And also a lot of the watercraft were so small that tall people had to hang their legs on either side, which led to higher numbers of leg fractures when people were slamming the boats into each other. But I wanted to talk about the Cannonball Loop because this was one ride that even the operators of this particular park considered too dangerous to remain in operation. It was only ever open for a single month. The Cannonball Loop was designed by the park's owner one afternoon on the back of a napkin and built, like many of the park's other rides, by whoever happened to be available. So it was a fully enclosed water slide with a complete 360-degree loop at the end. It looked very much like what it looks like on this slide here. That's not just an abstract image. It just came down like that and had a loop, fully enclosed. When the building of it was completed, many of the staff at the park who were asked to test it, they were so scared of it that the park owners had to offer them $100 each to test it out. One of the staff members who remembered it later said, $100 did not buy enough booze to drown out that memory. And the son of the park owner described it as more like a ride you had to survive than to have fun. The main problem with this ride was that you ended up going down like a long, unlit, wet tunnel. And if you didn't get up enough speed or there wasn't enough water, you would not make it around the loop at the end and you would be stuck. And a damp, dark, enclosed tunnel is really not a fun place to be stuck, especially when other riders might be coming down behind you at any time. If you did make it around the loop, you were also in for a pretty bad time. A Navy physician who investigated the ride found that if you successfully made it around the loop, you would experience 9 Gs of force, which is about the absolute limit that the human body can stand before it dies. It was also widely rumored that the crash test dummies that they put through the slide came out the other end in pieces. This ride resulted in broken noses and back injuries, and in some cases, riders came out with like these weird scratches on their bodies. Later investigators, they found that those scratches had come from the teeth of previous riders that had been knocked out during the ride and gotten stuck in the slide walls, which is right up on the top of the list of the creepiest things I have ever heard. A large part of what made this ride and this park so incredibly dangerous was that it was run by a man named Gene Mulvihill, whose entire approach was the theme park equivalent of move fast and break things. So in pursuit of the most intense, creative, and engaging water park experience ever, corners got cut in almost every respect, from construction to compliance. When Mulvihill was told that he needed insurance, he founded his own insurance company to sell policies back to himself. It was that kind of place. In some ways, the anything goes approach made the park kind of popular. There were plenty of people who grew up in the area and considered it to be a rite of passage to have been injured in the summer at Action Park. Action Park was also one of the very first water parks ever, and it was responsible for developing a lot of new ride ideas as a result of that. But many of these came at the expense of their patrons' bones and muscles and their lives. Action Park closed for good in 1996 after losing a significant amount of money to a growing number of personal injury lawsuits and the collapse and criminal prosecution of some of the financial schemes that had kept the park in operation. And if you're the same kind of combination of fascinated and horrified as I am, and you want to know more about this park because it is bonkers, there is a documentary about it called Class Action Park, which came out in 2020, and it's well worth a watch if you can find it. So among the many lessons we can take from this park, one of the more relevant for us today is this one: consult with experts. The Cannonball Loop went from a drawing on a napkin to an expensive physical monument to failure in the space of about a year. The insistence on doing it all in-house for the sake of, making a cool ride created an almost fatal pitch black hell tunnel full of teeth. There are very few apps that I would describe the same way, but fortunately, this situation is very easy to avoid in app dev, so long as you remember that when it comes to safety and security, you should not be winging it or coming up with your own designs. It can sometimes initially cost more and take more time to involve experts and to follow established standards when it comes to these things, but in the end, nobody wants their app in the news at the other end of a data breach, being the one exposed for storing passwords with a hand-rolled homebrew algorithm. Pitch black hell tunnel full of teeth. Just remember that. Consult the experts. There are no good shortcuts here. Our third and final venture into the world of terrible theme park rides is the human trebuchet, a thing which really, for real, existed in the 21st century, and we can't even blame dudes with mutton chops for it. So this is the story that you can use when someone is like, hey, we've fully automated the go live flow inside a macro in Google Sheets that's triggered by clicking a JPEG of an explosion. And then we've got our auth under control because the sheet is in a Google Drive folder that Steve is administrator of, which is also another thing that I have really seen for real in real life. So trebuchets, for those who weren't obsessed with the same kind of stuff that I was obsessed with as a kid, they are a kind of catapult that has been used by people wanting to fling projectiles at other people since at least the 4th century BC. Trebuchets were useful as a stationary defense for forts or as a siege weapon. And in the early 2000s, they had a brief but highly publicized reimagining as a theme park attraction. The human trebuchet was built at Middlemore Water Park in Somerset in the UK, which was, as far as I've been able to tell, otherwise a fairly normal water park. The ride was already breaking the pelvises of test riders in its prototype form, but it was apparently good enough in the end that it was built for real and opened to the public. So for 40 British pounds, you could sit in a chair, wait for a few nervous moments, and then suddenly be flung like 20 meters through the air at almost 100 kilometers an hour toward a large net, which you would then hopefully land on. There had never, ever, ever in theme park history been anyone who had decided to build a human trebuchet for fun. And people came from far and wide to have the unique experience of being hurled across a field without any supports, possibly followed by a cup of tea. Unsurprisingly, people got injured on this ride. There were broken arms and broken legs. They were very, very common. People who had been on the trebuchet or had watched others, they reported their concerns that people were landing very close to the front edge of the net rather than in the middle, which was what was intended. And then in 2002, the ride was finally shut down after a man missed the net altogether, landed on the ground, and then died of the injuries that he had sustained. And this leads me to our last lesson. Precedent may be missing for a reason. If you were in charge of coming up with theme park rides and you realized that nobody else had appeared to have ever made a human trebuchet, you might, in that kind of like discovery phase of the project, ask yourself why that might be. There is an allure to doing something daring and novel, doing something that the world has never seen. And when it works out, there is often praise and money and fame to go with it. And sometimes you might genuinely be onto a good thing that nobody else has ever thought of before. But if you find yourself in this position, it should also be a moment for pause. Is there a reason that nobody else has ever gone through with this? Is there an element or an aspect that you might have missed along the way? Have you weighed up the risks of your design decisions? Have you gotten the team together for a bit of an early stage threat model and mapped out some alternatives? Have you done all of that before you greenlight the project? Again, if the features that you are trying to be innovative about involve safety or security, you really should be doing extra checks, checking extra hard, doing a whole lot of validation before you start implementing things. There is a really fine line between disruptive and destructive, and most of the time, security features are not the place to walk that line. So, our ride has nearly reached its conclusion. Please ensure you have all of your belongings with you before you exit the carriage. Hopefully, in between all of the rest of the fine talks here today, these 3 tales that I've just told you, they have given you something extra to think about and something to talk about when your next senior stakeholder comes to the team with like a strange glint in their eye and a wild idea. Before you get too deep in the weeds with your security functions, whether that's writing your own custom code, recycling design patterns and algorithms from 20 years ago without checking to see if they're still good, or coming up with a weird new idea for ensuring that your users are who they say they are, or any number of things, take the time and check in with everybody, assess your risks, and involve the experts. For lots of reasons, it can be really tempting to want to do it all yourself, because who else knows your users and your product better than you do? But when it comes to both theme park rides and app security, you should never, ever roll your own. Trust the prior art. Leave the safety and security features to the folks who know what they are doing. At the end of the day, your users, your stakeholders, and your colleagues will thank you. The penetration testers might not thank you, but anything that makes my life slightly less exciting is not necessarily a bad thing, honestly. So thank you for being here today. That's all from me. Hopefully you've gotten something out of these weird stories, and I'm happy to take any questions or fade into the distance as is appropriate.
Thank you so much, Lily. Thank you so much for that different perspective that you brought in today from your talk. I know, the kind of the similarities that we could see there, was really interesting to look at. I'm sure most of us did not even think it from this perspective that, okay, we could correlate a lot of things that happen in the real world also into the security side of things. Thank you so much, Lily, again. Thank you so much for joining us from Australia. I know it's a very odd time right there now. You're joining us, I think it's pretty late in the evening now. So thank you so much.